Darrell as he lays out his lesson tonight, and help us to have open minds and open ears so that we can listen and hear and understand, and help us as we go from here to take those lessons and apply them to our lives. In the name of your Son we pray. Amen.
Thank you for that prayer. There are 3 handouts tonight. If you didn't get them by the doors on the way in, motion to somebody who's sitting close by and ask them to bring them to you, please. The first that I want to draw your attention to is the schedule that I promised you. It's called New Testament Character Studies. For the sake of putting my videos together, I've chosen to call this class The People of the New Testament, which I think is a more friendly title. And that really is what this class is about. And you'll notice on that schedule that the first one was Caesar's and Herod's. We didn't yet talk about Herod the Great. So I'm going to start off with that tonight. And then we'll go into the second class, which is the Jewish leadership. And I've got a couple of footnotes down below to tell what the contents of tonight's class and the next one will be about. And we're going to cover a lot of different groups of people in the next 2 class sessions. So it might feel like we're doing in a couple of sessions what should be done in a month, and that may be true. But of course we don't get to the characters that are spoken of a lot in the New Testament if we spend too much time on these guys who are historical characters. But I think it's necessary to understand the life and times, to understand what's going on historically, and also to introduce some of the characters that the Bible will just mention casually. For instance, the Pharisees will be mentioned many times. The publicans will be mentioned several times, the scribes. There are also some characters like the Hellenists who will be mentioned in passing, and the Herodians, that are mentioned a few times among the Gospels. So I want to spend a little time tonight explaining some background on the times and folding these people into the historical picture so that we have a better sense of who these people really are. And some of these handouts that I've given you will require your glasses if your eyes are old like mine and require you to have reading glasses to look close up. I apologize for that, but I didn't want to print out everything in large characters and give everybody a book to go home with. I almost did anyway. All right, so we'll start off tonight by talking about Herod the Great. And you have a sheet that's printed 2 sides on Herod the Great. And he's a fascinating character. I thought about just doing this in cursory fashion, summarizing what's here, and leaving this to your reading. But I think it's interesting enough for all of us that in order to keep everybody together, I wanted to just go through this quickly with you. Most of what we know about Herod the Great is from the Roman Jewish historian Josephus, who was contemporary with Titus Caesar, and he's the one who oversaw the destruction of Jerusalem. So he has about as close a knowledge of all this as any historian might, because he lived right at ground zero and at the time that all this was taking place. He was also in the know in the palace. He walked among the Roman politicians, and he was a Jew ethnically. So he understood both the Roman view of things and the Jewish view of things. Sometimes he might be thought by other historians to be taking a position that favored the Romans too much because he depended upon them too much for his livelihood. So that's kind of where you have to watch him. But he's a very reliable source for much of what we know about the New Testament period. Herod the Great lived between 72 BC and 4 BC. Now you say, wait a minute, wasn't Jesus born in 1? And Herod plays in his story. But no, apparently 1 AD was misdated. Historians generally agree now that Jesus was born about 4 BC, which is kind of ironic in itself. And that means he had to be born before Herod died, and probably not long before Herod died, because Herod kind of went crazy on us right before he died and did a lot of crazy things, among which might have been the killing of the innocents that Jesus fled with his parents. He was born in Idumea, which is south of Judea, and the Idumeans were not ethnically Jewish. They were ethnically Arab. This is the historical land of Edom, and so Petra is part of Idumea. Now part of Jordan. Most of Idumea is part of Jordan. So Herod was born in Idumea. His grandfather was an appointee of Alexander, the second king of the Hasmonean dynasty, and we'll talk about the Hasmoneans in just a little bit. But Alexander appointed Antipas the Edomite, the grandfather of Herod, as governor of Edom. So very high-ranking Idumean. Herod was the second son of Antipater, Antipas's son, the Idumean, and who was then chief advisor to Hyrcanus II. And Hyrcanus II was the successor to Alexander. So now that's not Alexander Alexander the Great. That's Alexander the Hasmonean. Okay, so we're talking about Jewish kings. Alexander was first. He was followed by Hyrcanus, and Herod's father was a chief advisor to Hyrcanus. And the name Cyprus, on that chart that I gave you Sunday, you saw the name Cyprus, a woman, mentioned several times. Well, this is the queen that many of those women were named after. She was a Nabatean Arab princess from Petra. He was raised, though, as a Jew, because at the point of the sword, many of the Idumeans had converted to Judaism under the Hasmonean kings. And so, even though he was ethnically Arabic, his family were practicing Jews. He rose to power largely through his father's good relationships with the Roman general and dictator Julius Caesar. And that'll get you places in the Roman Empire. He was appointed provincial governor in Galilee in about 47 BC when he was 25 to 28 years old. That's pretty early to get charge of a whole province. In 41 BC, Mark Antony named Herod and his brother Phaziel as tetrarchs to support Hyrcanus II, who was then the king. In 40, Antigonus, Hyrcanus' nephew, okay, so we're talking about Hasmoneans again, Hyrcanus' nephew, took the Judean throne from his uncle with the help of the Parthians. There's all this intrigue that's constantly going on in these areas, in outlying the Roman, at the outskirts of the Roman Empire, or in this case, the Greeks were still in control. Herod fled to Rome then to plead for Hyrcanus' restoration to power, but was surprisingly appointed the king of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 39 or 40 BC, and thus he became a Roman Jewish client king. All of a sudden, he thought he was going to go in support of the guy he worked for, and he finds himself king. All right. Although officially king, he still had to return to Judah and win his kingdom from Antigonus, who had taken it by force. Toward the end of his campaign, he married the granddaughter of Hyrcanus, a niece of Antigonus. You got all this? You can go home and study this more later. Her name was Mariamne I. Okay, so this is Herod's first wife that you saw on that big chart that I gave you on Sunday, to secure his claim to the throne and gain Jewish favor. So you want to be in favor with the Jews, you marry someone who is already established in the Hasmonean Empire, or in the Hasmonean dynasty. So he already had a wife, though, Doris, and a young son, Antipater, and chose therefore to banish Doris and her child. Herod and Sosius, the governor of Syria, finished capturing Jerusalem in AD 37, ushering in the Herodian dynasty and putting an end to the Hasmoneans. He ruled for 37 years, 34 after capturing Jerusalem. His religious commitment was questionable for good reasons by the Jewish society. He publicly identified himself as a Jew, but this was undermined by his decadent lifestyle, not just of his, but of his entire family. He famously executed several members of his own family, including his wife, Mary Amne I, and his first 3 sons. Augustus famously then commented that it would be better to be Herod's pig than his son, because the Jews wouldn't slaughter a pig, but apparently Herod would kill his own sons. There were 2 major threats to Herod's rule at its beginning. His mother-in-law, wouldn't you know, Alexandra, sought to regain power for her family, the Hasmoneans. So she asked Cleopatra, who was then in Alexandria, asked Cleopatra to make Aristobulus III, another Hasmonean, the high priest. So Herod dispensed with him by having him assassinated, thus continuing to cut off all the Hasmoneans and establishing his dynasty. The second challenge was Herod chose to side with Antony over Octavian. In the great civil war in Rome that established Augustus as the Caesar. So he made a quick trip to Rome to try to win back Augustus's favor after having slighted him in that way, and somehow he must have been a pretty good politician, because he managed to convince Augustus not only to spare his life, but also let him to remain king over this area. He installed extreme security measures due to the people's contempt for him. He used secret police to monitor and report the feelings of the populace toward him, just like dictators nowadays do. Send out spies throughout the town, and if anybody says anything bad about them, send them to me. Prohibited protests and had opponents removed by force. Put down all uprisings against you. Had a bodyguard of 2,000 soldiers, among which were Jewish elite soldiers and the former bodyguards of Cleopatra, after she was defeated by Augustus, and modeled after Augustus's bodyguards. He was generally conformed to traditional Jewish laws where convenient, but more often disregarded Jewish sensibilities. So, for example, he introduced foreign forms of entertainment that identified him with the Hellenists, the Greek-influenced. He erected a golden eagle at the entrance of the temple, suggesting an allegiance to Rome over the allegiance to God. And he offset his faltering reputation with lavish gifts at the expense of heavy taxes. So he taxed the Jews heavily so that he could pay off political favors to people he wanted to keep on his side. Both the Pharisees and the Sadducees opposed Herod. In fact, everybody historically opposes Herod. The Jews oppose Herod. The Christians oppose Herod. And the major ruling classes of the Jews opposed him. The Pharisees were discontented because he disregarded many of their demands when he was building the temple. And that's something they cared deeply about, as did the Sadducees, who were the priestly class. They were closely associated with priestly responsibilities in the temple and opposed Herod because he replaced their high priests with outsiders from Babylonia and Alexandria in an effort to gain support from the Jewish diaspora. That will anger the high priestly class by bringing in high priests from Babylon and setting him up in the temple in order to gain the favor of the Jews in Babylon. That's the way Herod played his politics. He appears, of course, on the other side of the sheet, appears in the Gospel of Matthew as the ruler of Judea who orders the massacre of the innocents. Now, you may read in secular histories that this is a highly questionable event, which you've read a million times before, that has eventually been proven false. And I say here that this also, I don't know whether it'll ever be proven that this event ever actually took place apart from the Bible. Because think about the scale of this. We think about, okay, killing all the boys 2 years and younger in Bethlehem. How many people are in Bethlehem? It's estimated maybe at the time, maybe 2,000. What portion of those are below the age of 2? You might estimate something like 2 to 4%. So we're talking about 40 to 80 babies. It's not a lot, and it is a lot for a town to endure, but it's not the large-scale, massive massacre like some of these kings were guilty of, where they'd take 3,000 people into the temple and kill them all at once. Okay, so this could end up as a footnote somewhere in history, whereas we see it as, in a biblical story, as an indication of just how cruel Herod was, and also as an indication of God's providence for his plan to lead Jesus out of Bethlehem and take him to Egypt to wait until the storm blew over, which it did quickly because Herod died a short time after that. By the end of his reign, anger and dissatisfaction of the people, among the people were common, as you can imagine. There were messianic hopes, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the Jews might someday overthrow the Roman overlords. That's often cited as the reason why the apostles didn't get it when Jesus talked about his death. You know, they were expecting someone to come and rescue him from Rome. Maybe that's true. The Bible doesn't actually say that, but there are many historical documents from the time that showed that messianic expectations indicated that the Messiah would be a military ruler who would smash the Roman authority and free the Jews once and for all. Purportedly, he was so concerned that no one would mourn his death that he commanded a large group of distinguished men to be killed at the same time to effect an outpouring of grief. But this command was not carried out by his successors. This is one commandment they had the good sense not to obey, and since he's dead, what's he going to do about it, right? He died in Jericho somewhere between 4 and 1 BC after an excruciatingly painful, putrefying illness of uncertain cause, and may have attempted suicide by stabbing. That's one historical report that hasn't been corroborated. Outbreaks of violence and riots followed his death, not because people were upset that he was dead. They were upset because he'd been such a cruel leader up to this point in time. According to contemporary historians, Herod the Great is perhaps the only figure in ancient Jewish history who has been loathed equally by Jewish and Christian posterity. That's something to take to your grave. Herod's body was carried to Herodium. A tomb matching the location identified by Josephus was discovered in 2007. The tomb contained a broken sarcophagus, but no remains of a body. The accuracy of the location has been challenged. Even though a tomb was found there, the question is whether it was Herod's tomb. And there weren't a lot of identifiers. It was small, unpretentious tomb, which Herod would not have planned for himself, of course, but if everybody else is ticked off at him, it might be just what he got. Who knows? Augustus respected the terms of Herod's will, which stipulated the division of the kingdom among 3 of his sons. And these are the guys that you'll hear about most often in the New Testament. Herod Archelaus appears only once, ethnarch of Judea. Ethnarch just means ruler of an ethnic group. Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. He's mentioned once in Matthew chapter 2, verse 22. If you'll recall, the situation there was when they returned from Egypt, Joseph was afraid to settle in Judea, so he went to Nazareth instead and took up residence there. And the reason he was afraid to go to Judea is because Archelaus was in power, and apparently he was even more cruel than his father had been. He was eventually adjudged unfit to rule by the Caesar in Rome and was removed. Herod Antipas was Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea until 39, when he was deposed and exiled. Many verses speak of him, and we're going to have another class that will talk more specifically about him and where he fits into the biblical picture. He appears on that graphic that I gave you on Sunday with a number of biblical verses where you can find him referenced. Philip the Tetrarch, also known as Herod Philip the Second. This is not the first son, Herod Philip the First. A second son, also named Philip. Why did he name a second son Philip? Well, possibly because he wrote the first Philip out of his will. All right, so this is Philip the Tetrarch. This is the second Herod Philip. Became Tetrarch of the territories north and east of the Jordan and ruled until his death in AD 34. I should have mentioned that the Herod that was in control of Nazareth was much more acceptable to the Jews than Herod the Great had been. And so it made a reasonably good landing spot for Joseph and his family. Augustus judged Archelaus incompetent to rule, as I said earlier, removed him from power, and combined the provinces of Samaria, Judea proper, and Idumea into a province, the Roman province Idumea, placed under a prefect of which Pontius Pilate would become one. So we'll hear about Pontius Pilate. If you wonder why there's not a tetrarch over the territory at the time, that would be the reason. All right. Any questions about Herod the Great? That was a lot of detail in a short time. That's why I printed it all out for you to take home if you want to go back and look at it later. A lot of information for the few references he has in the New Testament, but really important into understanding the rulership of Palestine going forward and the politics involved. All right. Now, the cast of characters continued. First of all, the Hellenists. Well, whenever there's a dominant cultural influence in the world, that influence encroaches on territories under its control, and even more broadly. English is spoken all over the world. It's the language of science. It supplanted German as the language of science. I can go to a scientific conference anywhere in the world and hear English spoken. It sort of plays the same role that Greek played in this culture. Greek was sort of the established language of all the territories since Alexander the Great. And so everybody who is anybody wrote in Greek. Well, it wasn't just the language that permeated all the Greek outlands. It was also their culture. So one of the marks of Greek culture was wrestling would come to the province, and a gymnasium would come to the province where the competitions would take place. And this was a thorn in the side of the Jewish leadership, the Pharisees in particular, because they wanted to rid Jerusalem of Hellenistic influence, and they really disliked the fact that men get out in the gymnasium and wrestle naked, and especially when it's their priests, because it was the priests that took part in this for the most part. This happened in the Greek colonies beginning in the 4th century BC. The most prominent Greek cities where Hellenized Jews lived in the region were in Antioch, in Syria. Remember hearing about the Hellenistic Jews in Antioch in reading the New Testament? And Alexandria in Egypt, which is where we got the Septuagint version of the Greek version of the Old Testament. This was a diaspora of choice. The Jews weren't forced to leave Palestine at this time, but Jewish business people got around, and people who wanted to live in more comfortable climes for one reason or other, they would move into the other Greek colonies and had freedom to travel. And the diaspora, being higher ups, had oftentimes enjoyed close ties with the Greek elites. And so there are a lot of very prominent Jews in the Greek colonies. Although a core of traditionalists despised Hellenization, a gymnasium was installed in Jerusalem by a Jewish high priest The installation ceremony was overseen by a Jewish high priest, and the priests engaged in wrestling matches. Now, recognize that the Jews were the priests were more easily Hellenized than the Pharisees were, and we'll talk about the reasons for that in a minute. The Jewish and Greek cultures seem to be compatible in most ways by most people until Antiochus IV. And this guy is the infamous Greek Seleucid leader that wanted to sacrifice pig's flesh on the altar in the temple, and was engaged in a number of really heinous acts from the standpoint of the Jewish leadership, and eventually just got to the point where it could not be ignored. The Jews generally did not pay honor to the gods of the Greek pantheon or take part in their religious observances, even though they did take part in the Olympic Games. Okay, so that's Hellenism and Hellenistic influence. So when you read about the Hellenistic Jews in Acts chapter 6 in Jerusalem, that gives you a hint as to who these people are and how they came to be Hellenized. Okay? The Hasmoneans, we've mentioned several times already. So who are these people? Well, as you notice, they were the leadership leading up to the Herods. How did they get there? Well, Palestine was under the control of the Seleucid Greeks in the late Greek Empire. It was a brutally harsh dynasty. The most infamous being the man I just told you about, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And if you want to read about a prophecy concerning him, read the book of Daniel. Many people believe the abomination of desolation that was spoken of, that was going to be in the temple, that would tell the Jews that the desolation of Jerusalem was near. The proverbial straw that broke the camel's back was the erection and dedication of the altar to Zeus in the temple. That'll upset a Jew. His heinous acts ignited the Maccabean revolt in 167 to 165 BC. And the Maccabeans, not by heredity, but by rulership control, eventuated into the Hasmonean dynasty. A Jewish priest named Mattathias the Hasmonean, having refused to offer a sacrifice to a Greek god, killed a priest who stepped forward to do so in his place. Although ignited by the acts of Antiochus, the revolt is viewed by historians as at least equally a civil war of traditional Judaism, against Grecian Jews, Hellenism. That makes it really interesting, doesn't it, that both Hellenistic Jews and Jews from Jerusalem could come together under the banner of Christianity. And it made it pivotal what happened in Acts chapter 6, where the Jewish leadership was overlooking the Hellenized Jews in the daily administration. This was seen as an act of prejudice, an act of bigotry, and could have blown the church wide open had it not been handled well. Mattathias fled to the wilderness with his 5 sons. This began the Maccabean revolt. When he was killed, his son Judah Maccabee led the revolt that eventuated in the overthrow of the Seleucids through guerrilla warfare. Pretty impressive accomplishment to overthrow the Greek leadership through guerrilla warfare. The war quickly became an attempt at liberation of the Jewish nation from foreign rule, both domestically and abroad, and there was some question and some infighting over how far this should go. Should we take our war on into Babylonia? Should we take it on into Egypt to free all those Jews who are under the influence of these other governments? And so the Hasmonean dynasty within itself had some civil war that broke out over these questions. The Hasmoneans were established as the ruling dynasty in Jerusalem, with Simon, the only remaining son of Mattathias, established as king priest. Now, if you recall, Mattathias was the one who was going to be offering a sacrifice. When he refused to do it, he was a recognized high priest. So his son, being established as king, then would be both priest and king. He's looking messianic, isn't he? The king priest from Zechariah. Okay, so a lot of intrigue again surrounding the Hasmonean dynasty. Is this the Messiah? This Simon? There was continued warfare and unhappy alliances between the Hasmoneans and the Seleucids, the old Greek leaders, until the death of Antiochus by disease in 129. That ended. The Hasmoneans ruled independently from that point forward through 63 BC, when the Roman general Pompey ended a civil war between the Hasmoneans and made Judea a Roman client state. All right, so the Romans are in town now to keep things settled down, keep civil war from breaking out, and the Hasmoneans have been deposed and replaced with Herod. The last Hasmonean king, Antigonus Mattathias, was ordered to be assassinated by Mark Antony. That puts the end to that, doesn't it? And the Hasmonean dynasty was ended with the establishment of Herod as the client king in 37. That's the Hasmoneans. Any of you watched The Chosen? There's a episode, I haven't seen much of it. There was an episode where she has some kind of cloth, and he says, he says, do you know where that comes from? And she says, no. And he says, it's Hasmonean. So he's dating that artifact that she has, the valuable possession that she has in her hands. All right, so first, co-regent with the Seleucids, and then defeated the Seleucids and became an independent state up until Rome comes in to settle all the back and forth between the Hasmoneans and establishes Herod and his throne and his dynasty. So throughout the New Testament period, all that we read of it, there will be a Herod on the throne. All right, the high priest and the chief priests. We may not finish all these tonight, and if we don't, that's okay, because I've got Sunday also, and we have more in this cast of characters. All right, so we're looking kind of at the priestly side tonight, and on Sunday we'll be looking more at the Pharisaical side, and we'll talk about what the difference is between those two. All right, so high priests and chief priests. We know high priests, right? We've had high priests all the way back since Aaron. They were originally the course of Aaron, first conferred on Aaron by Moses, and was hereditary and for life. However, in the 2nd century BC, bribery led to several reappointments, and the last of the high priests were appointed by government officials or chosen by lot. Okay, so the course of Aaron is now ended. These have become political appointments, oftentimes given to the highest bidder. The high priest has lost his respect of the people that was offered to him through the traditions. And now, according to tradition, 18 high priests served in Solomon's temple and 60 in the Second Temple period. And we're talking about the Second Temple period. Chief priests were members of the family of the high priest and or those acting under his authority. The priestly class in the time of Jesus were aristocrats with an inherent authority of the Mosaic law, but often without the appropriate credentials or pedigree. So the people are conflicted about this. He's got all of the garb of the priest, he's holding the place of the priest, and he's got the backing of the Roman government. But he's not really supposed to be a priest. And yet, you're beholden to the temple, so what are you going to do? They carried with them the political authority of the Roman government. In a country where I traveled to, there were a group of police, religious police, that were controlled by the government, who were both the heads of the church and also beholden to the state, and couldn't teach anything from the pulpit that the state didn't allow them to teach. Very similar to what's going on here. So you've got somebody who's serving kind of as a mediator between the state authority and the religious authority. So if anybody's going to get in trouble, because of a religious crime, who are they going to send? The temple guards. And so we'll have many examples of that in the New Testament. The chief priests are the ones the bad guys who come in anytime somebody's about to get arrested, or they think somebody's about to get arrested for a religious crime. It fell upon them to decide what was ceremonially clean or unclean, which Jesus seemed to upend and would give a reason why they would be at odds with him. Any case where someone was arrested in the temple, and there are several examples that I've cited for you here, and they're in your handout, so you don't have to try to write these down, would likely have involved the temple guard. That includes the apostles in the temple. It includes one time when they showed up to arrest Jesus and they didn't. Times when they could have arrested Jesus and they didn't, and he accused them. He said, I was there in the temple teaching every day. You've got the guard right there. Why didn't anybody arrest me? Since 70, there's been no Jewish high priest because national sacrifice was permanently interrupted with the destruction of the Second Temple. So that ended the high priestly line and the temple priests altogether. Take a breath. Who are the Herodians that are mentioned a few times? Well, we've already mentioned the Herods. It had quite a bit to say about them, and you got a huge handout showing you who the Herods were. The Herodians were supporters and or family members of the Herods. What does that mean politically? Well, it means that you're beholden to Rome. So if you're a Jew and you're a supporter of Herod, you're okay with Roman government. If you're a Pharisee, you're probably not. So the Pharisees are naturally at odds with the Herodians. And yet, if you're a Herodian, it implies that you're compromised, that your observance of the Mosaic law is subjugated to the Jewish way of doing things, just like in foreign countries where you've got this same kind of thing going on. They try to subjugate all the religion to the state. That's really important if you want to maintain that the head political leader is charge over everything, God included. You subjugate God through the priests to the head of state. Okay, so these people are compromised if they are going to back Herod, and makes them unlikely allies of the Pharisees and politically more compatible with the Sadducees, who were okay with Roman rule, who kept them in power and gave them power. The Herodians appear only on 2 occasions in the New Testament, Mark chapter 3, verse 6, and also in Mark 12:13, and that narrative is repeated in Matthew 22 and verse 16. In both instances, they're conspiring with the Pharisees, their unlikely allies, against Jesus. And in one case, and we'll talk about this, the Herodians favored the payment of taxes to Caesar because they wanted to support Herod. The Pharisees opposed it. And so what did they do in Mark chapter 12, verse 13? The Pharisees and the Herodians came to Jesus together to trap him in a question about paying taxes. Should we pay our taxes or not? If Jesus answers with the Pharisees, he shows himself to be an enemy of Rome. If he answers with the Herodians, he offends the popular Jewish religious sensibilities because they all agree with the Pharisees. We shouldn't have to pay taxes to Rome. So Jesus is in a real pickle, right? Remember his answer? See the coin? Whose picture does it have on it? Caesar. If the Herodians wanted to capture him, he gave them no reason to do so, but instead convicted them on religious grounds, given to God what is God's. He also convicted the Pharisees of duplicity in withholding that which is Caesar's, their taxes, without even saying so. Sadducees, bigger players than everything. We've got 5 minutes for Sadducees. aristocratic conservatives of the Jewish people. Now understand what we mean when we say conservative here. We mean conservative in terms of their interpretation of the documents that they hold dear, and that is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, and only the Torah. Extremely dedicated to the minutia of the Leviticus and how making sure everything goes the way it's supposed to in the temple. And so obviously priests are largely going to be Sadducees because they care about that too. They controlled the Jewish temple and thus much of Jewish society. Most, but not all the priests were Sadducees. They accepted as scripture only the Torah, not the oral Torah, which was supposedly orally spoken to Moses on the mountain that we don't get in the written law, and the rest of the Jewish canon. So they didn't accept, for example, the book of Hosea on the same, as they didn't view it on the same plane as those first 5 books of the Old Testament. They didn't even view Joshua on the same plane as they viewed the law. Insisted on strict interpretation and enforcement of all the commands, rigidly dogmatic, all about law and order, which bolstered their popularity with Rome. Romans liked law and order in their provinces. As we know, they did not believe in angels, spirits, or life after death, and there are a couple of scriptures to back that up. They were not very popular with the commoners, but their control over the temple and their close ties to Roman government gave them power. They were powerful whether the people liked it or not, and generally they didn't. When the temple was destroyed in AD 70, they lost that power and disappeared from the scene, since the temple and its observances were their life's work. No more temple, no more Sadducees, no more high priest. We did it. I should have told you right at the outset of this, I am not a historian. Obviously, I've spent quite a bit of time working through all this, and even over a period of years accumulating some information that I've put together for you here in summary form. You could ask me a few questions, and it would be quickly become obvious that I'm not a historian. But if you have any questions, maybe we can talk through it, and if I can't answer it off the cuff, maybe I can come back to you with an answer. I know it's too much, isn't it? Have one question. No burning questions for what we've talked about?
What was the Sadducees' view of the Psalms?
That they were part of the Jewish body of traditional literature, but not to be taken as a source of law. And so anything that was talked about in those later books, this is why they didn't believe in a resurrection, because the Psalms actually seemed to speak about a resurrection. They didn't necessarily think so much about the nature of Messiah, because that wasn't so much part of the Torah. You kind of had to read between the lines in those first 5 books to see any of it. So as they saw it, there was kind of a hierarchy of literature, and at the core, at the base of that hierarchy was the law, and anything else was at least secondary to that body of literature. So the deuterocanonical books, as they're called, the ones that show up in the Catholic canon that don't show up in the Protestant canon, that would have also been regarded by them as Jewish literature, but would not have been accepted as part of their canon. And the Pharisees, the rabbinical schools, didn't accept those books either, by the way. Thank you. We'll see you on Sunday.